Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on February 10th, 2017, and you're listening to episode 19. Politicoast is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticoastPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian.
And congratulations to America for finally tackling their school drizzly problem.
Oh, it's just every week is another round of terrible stories from the US that I just don't want to talk about because that's about 20 other podcasts that already exist, and luckily they are tackling it. Ones I do want to give a shout out to today are a couple other Canadian podcasts, because I've just put up a list on our website at politicos.ca of Canadian political podcasts, at least ones that aren't total shit, as in Rebel. And I wanted to mention a couple specifically, like Canadian Political Underground and Zachary, who gave us a nice shout out on his last show. He's only been doing his show for a few weeks or a couple months now. The Broadcast, which is out of Alberta, it's a couple women talking about women in Alberta politics, and it's really cool. They had Sandra Jansen, the former PC party leadership candidate, now NDP MLA, on to just talk about the abuse she suffered. Another one I'm really liking is The Boys in Short Pants, which is two masters of poli-sci guys out of Carleton University, and they're just sort of the rebirth of the strategists, maybe. They're just snarky and make fun of things. And one that just came out today is 12th and Cambie, which is Vancouver Courier's Mike Howell's new podcast. In the first one, he interviews Gregor Robertson, and so it's going to be like a hyper-local version of us almost. What's interesting in there, and I'll spoil the first podcast in case you don't listen to it, but Gregor's going to run again and will potentially be the longest serving mayor in Vancouver history if he wins, which is interesting. But let's jump into our first segment, Alternative Hacks.
You know, we saw them trying to hack into our website the other day.
I have no problem saying sorry because I made a mistake. And I shouldn't have jumped to those conclusions as quickly as I did.
So last week, the BC Liberals leaked the NDP climate strategy, and we talked about the problems there in the NDP's camp with them having a mole. But earlier this week, Mike Smith at the province found some privacy leaks on the BC Liberals website. He found a list of people who'd filled out a survey from a small town, including all their contact information. He didn't publish that, but he went, I just visited this page, saw this list, and it was publicly available when it shouldn't be. So he asked the Premier about this in a Facebook Live interview, and she sort of said it was the NDP hacking their website or someone on the other side of the aisle. And she sort of like doubled down on this, and people are like, you can't just say that. You have to have some evidence. And she didn't really give any. Eventually, she sort of mentioned that they had evidence that someone accessed their site from within the BC legislature. And then finally, today or yesterday, Vicky Huntington, the independent MLA, who's actually stepping down, she owned up that she was the person who told Mike Smith about this story. And it wasn't that she was hacking the BC Liberals website. It's just that she figured this out, or her team figured it out, tipped him off, and then went, all right, this story is blowing way out of proportion. Let's bring this back to talk about the privacy breach, which is the sort of core issue here, and really stop letting the Premier get away with these sort of alternative facts about hacking. And today, Christy Clark finally apologized by calling the press gallery and leaving a message with John Horgan. So that all happened.
It's one really bizarre saga coming out of Victoria over this whole thing. So the Liberals made a mistake. You know, it happens. It's not good. It's illegal in this case. It violates the Privacy Act. What it was people's survey responses, email addresses, and postal codes for all of this, which is, you know, useful stuff for parties to have, but shouldn't be the sort of thing that's publicly available. And they forgot to kind of wall it off from the rest of the internet, which is a pretty big mistake on their part. But, you know, it's the sort of thing that occasionally happens. Normally, it wouldn't be such a big deal. There's a small, mea culpa. We screwed up. Sorry about this. Maybe some low-level staffer gets fired over it, and that's it. But instead of going with that and letting story die, they've doubled down on it and just gone off on this frankly bizarre attack on the NDP over it. And I'm not sure what Christy Clark was thinking. Maybe it was hacking has been in the news and that's what she latched onto, or who knows.
Well, in that same Facebook Live interview where she said the word hack, and that's the clip we just played, she talks about how the NDP have talked about how this is going to be the most ugly campaign in BC's history, when that quote was actually misattributed. It wasn't anyone in the NDP who first said that. I'm sure, of course, partisans have said that because it's pretty obvious where we're going. But in that interview, she also talked about how hacking is illegal and you could face 10 years in jail time. And she doubled down on this in repeated interviews, would talk about, well, they sort of brought it up first. And John Horgan was sort of put with this and just, look, I can't imagine how confused he felt all week, just going, what is going on? So they had to start talking with their lawyers to go, can we sue the premier for libel? Like, is that something you do at this point? So full credit to Vicky Huntington for trying to squash this, but I think it almost exposed a level of maybe Christy Clark was testing the, can I play the Donald Trump, like say outrageous things and just run with it? Only it's not really in her, so she did have to apologize at the end. And she didn't, like, we played a tiny clip of her apology, but it reportedly went on quite a bit with the media and, lots and lots of, I'm sorry, I shouldn't really have said that. Sometimes we just get carried away. And it's just such a mess. What I almost have to wonder, like you mentioned, this was sort of a common mistake. As far as I can tell, the BC Liberals website runs on WordPress, which is the same thing that's running our website. It's a very common hosting situation. It's got lots of security holes because people are always trying to break it down because it runs so many websites. So if you're not keeping it up to date with the latest patches, these kind of things will happen. So what I'm more wondering is, with last week's story of the NDP leak and this week's story with the sort of privacy breach on the Liberals, why are our parties so incompetent when they have so much money?
Yeah, that is a good question, and my guess on it is they're probably just putting all the money up front on the politicking of it and letting the kind of background web management and system admin stuff kind of get put on the back burner. And it's a common problem that, organizations want to spend the money on what their kind of core competency and core focus is, which in the BC Liberals case is trying to win elections. So they let the other stuff kind of slide and only really touch on it when it becomes a serious problem. So that would be my guess, is it's just nobody's priority right now.
Yeah, we're 3 months out from an election. You'd kind of expect them to start to ramp up their game and put more focus on the nitty-gritty, as well as the bigger communications like you're mentioning. But it's also kind of a sign of how dirty things are going to get. We might be having these sort of alternative facts, these just like blatant statements from the premier, from the NDP potentially, if they've opened up this realm. One thing Adrian Dix was criticized a lot for, and Thomas Mulcair even, in the last couple elections, was being too nice, not going on the attack against the BC Liberals or the federal Conservatives. And I think John Horgan knows that, and he's trying to figure out how aggressive can he be. This sets the bar pretty low in the mud for where we can go.
Yeah, politics has always been a bit of a blood sport, and nastiness kind of just comes with the territory, but typically parties and politicians stop short of accusing the other party of criminal action, especially on such a weak case such as this, where there's no real evidence that it was the NDP, and in fact it's turned out not to be the NDP, and even if it was the NDP, they didn't actually commit any crimes because this was publicly, put on a public website.
Then the other angle that Vicky Huntington brought up today is she called Clark a diva of deflection and argued that Clark purposefully almost blew this story up. Like you were saying, it wasn't much until she started talking about hacking. Like it was one story in the province that was like, this is embarrassing, but it'll probably go away. And then it became this whole thing. what's against the background this week is the report on Alex Gervais' death. And this was an 18-year-old boy who was living in a foster care situation who committed suicide in 2015. And the report has basically damned everyone. It showed multiple warning signs being ignored and just failures across the system. Gervais had been sort of bounced around different caregivers who were just collecting paychecks. The final one, it sounds like, had clear links to violence and gangs and guns and was signed off by the ministry. So you have this terrible story for the government. And on the other hand, you have Christy Clark going, well, but the NDP's hacking us. And it kind of obfuscates and muddies the water. The absurd hacking allegation is much sexier news than government is letting children die.
Yeah, it's a tried and true tactic in politics is to change the channel and make something else the story whenever there's something you don't want to talk about. And I suppose it's just an open question right now on whether this was intentional or whether the premier just said something stupid and tried to double down on it when she was called on it. Yeah, I can certainly see the premier not being briefed on, the fact that someone in IT screwed up and then getting surprised by it in an interview or something. And there are plausible scenarios where this might have been a surprise, and if she found out somebody in the legislature had accessed their confidential stuff, jumping to the conclusion that hacking may have been involved. It may be premature, but not unreasonable. It's, within the realm of possibility. So I can kind of see that. I can also kind of see this being a calculated, we're just going to throw a bunch of shit up in the air and hopefully somebody notices that and not the issue we have going on right now that we don't want to talk about. So I'm kind of of two minds on which this is.
I think coming into the election campaign, as we have more controversies come up, how the premier responds and how the BC Liberals play it, and whether they start throwing more ridiculous things out, sort of Donald Trump style, that'll be the signal to me, whether they're just sort of using outrage to distract from issues. In this same week, there was also stories about the government hiring a BC Liberal staffer who was then allowed to go to campaign events and sort of work still for the BC Liberal Party. And that's all legal, apparently, in BC, because this is the way our province works. And the NDP and Greens have also done it to some extent, where the people working for their MP's office have also worked for the party. But it gets into this moral gray area where you have partisan hacks essentially being paid by the government. And the question is, when are they nonpartisan government employees and when are they partisan hacks? We also had this weird letter that was released from an FOI request from the newspapers that was looking into the Vancouver School Board firing last fall. And what they found was there was one staffer who'd written to the education minister complaining about the environment of the workplace they were working in. Didn't bring that complaint to the school board as far as we know, but addressed the letter as Dear Mike, as though this staffer is on first name basis with the education minister. That whole story is very muddy and no one really knows what's going on, but it does hint that there's a lot of ties with the BC Liberal Party. When I grew up in Alberta, we had the Progressive Conservatives in power for 40 years. And if you worked in any level of government, you were connected to the PC party at some level. And that kind of happens when you have a government that sticks around too long and you get a lot of these kind of warning flags about how corrupt are they.
Yeah, that's actually one thing that ties all of this together, is all of these seem to be the sort of thing that just kind of happens once you get to be in power for more than a decade and bad habits and bad decisions start to set in, and it's something every party seems to do after a certain point. And this just seems to me a pretty clear case of all of these point to the fact that it wouldn't be a bad idea for kind of a little house clearing to go on here. Yeah, have the Liberal Party kind of spend a little time regrouping and reassessing those sorts of things before they ever get back in power. And even for parties where, I'm in strong support of them, I tend to see a value in being out of power for a little while just to get rid of these sorts of bad habits that accumulate. And I think it's pretty clear at this point, the BC Liberals have hit just as the Ontario Liberals have hit that. And the PCs in Alberta spent decades hitting that point.
Going forward, the biggest thing to watch for in the short term is going to be the BC Liberals' throne speech next week. The legislature is returning for a short session before the election campaign kicks off. They didn't have a fall session. So if there's any last things the Premier wants to do, this is going to be the time. But what I think we're obviously going to see it as more is just a pre-election pitch. This is going to be lots of money for lots of pocketbook things across the province. And
yeah, this is almost certainly going to be this is the tone we're going to set for our campaign. This is our preview of what we're going to be talking about speech. Just as, typically the last budget before our campaign tends to be this is what our platform's going to be, big hint. The last throne speech will be the same thing.
Moving forward to our second segment, Sue Trudeau for Free, we're going to have friend of the podcast, Micah, take us through the Liberals' announcement to relaunch the Court Challenges program. Take it away, Micah.
Fellas, thank you very much for bringing me back on the program. Pleased to talk about the Court Challenges program today. When your charter rights or other constitutional rights are infringed upon or otherwise are not respected, one way to manage the issue is to take the government to court to reach a resolution. Now, as we're seeing in the United States, the law can serve as a bulwark against harmful acts undertaken by the state and state powers. Federal Court of Appeal in the United States provided an injunction against President Trump's so-called Muslim ban just today. That's one example. To put that in other words, courts have the power to compel the state and state actors to ensure its laws and practices do not violate the Charter or other parts of our Constitution. Court actions, however, are extremely expensive, as any lawyer will tell you, especially when they involve charter applications. Therein lies the policy behind the Court Challenges program. It is to provide financial support to those who want to use the courts to have those rights respected, but lack the funds to do it themselves. The pioneers of the CCP, the Court Challenges program, are Mulroney and Trudeau Sr., Trudeau on the language rights and Mulroney on the equality rights, and that's mostly because of the timing when the charter was enacted. At present, the CCP funds language rights and equality rights that it judges to be cases of national significance that also involve important legal issues that haven't been decided yet by the courts. And proponents of the CCP point to several victories. They argue that the CCP helped confirm that Canadians accused of a crime can have a trial in their own language, that the CCP affirmed the right of official language minority groups to manage their own school boards and to higher education in their mother tongue, ensured homosexual couples achieve equality protection, including secure spousal benefits, confirmed that Aboriginal Canadians living off reserve have the right to vote in band elections. They've assisted women to win pay equality cases. But of course, there's two sides to every coin, and detractors say that these are purely left-wing challenges, and the government has no business lining the pockets of lawyers like myself to bring court challenges by people that represent the fringes of Canada. Courts, after all, should be neutral and should not be politicized. Certainly, it makes no sense for the federal government to pay for the privilege of seeing its own laws challenged in court. So there you see the two sides sort of meeting up. Everybody agrees that courts shouldn't be politicized. We shouldn't have liberal judges. We shouldn't have conservative judges. We should just have judges. That's why they wear black in court. But not everyone agrees with whether government should be funding arguments by non-state actors to essentially challenge the laws passed by those state actors. Because the CCP is so limited in scope and only at the moment concerns itself with two areas of the Charter, the program is likely going to continue to be focused on areas of socially liberal development, although to be honest, I would argue that that has much more to do with the judges overseeing the case. Remember, these challenges are brought by the government, and that may be a problem, but really it has to be the judges that agree with this conception or these challenges that are being brought So it would seem to me that really the issue would be with the interpretation of the charter rather than the arguments themselves, although that might be just a chicken and argument, because you don't get them to the court unless you have the funding to bring them into court in the first place. There's a broader issue here. That's sort of the groundwork with how the CCP works and the policy discussions around it. But the bigger issue is, how are we going to deal with the access to justice crisis that we face in this country? Most people cannot afford a lawsuit. Your average middle-class Canadian simply can't afford $60,000, $50,000 to go to trial. Given that we're in the midst of a legal aid crisis and it's tragically underfunded, is there something that needs to be done? This is really only one piece of that puzzle. This deals specifically with constitutional challenges, but what happens when you face a criminal charge and you can't afford a lawyer and legal aid will only pay that lawyer to do a couple of hours of research for you? Is that a fair system? And should we really be relying on nonprofits like the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association or similar organizations to do this? Third-party nonprofit NGOs seemingly have not been able to keep up with the demands of the criminal justice system or the justice system as a whole. Just to give you some perspective on the funding level of this program, when funding from the federal government was abolished by the Conservative government, the funding level was about $5.5 million, and it's near there now. Trudeau has announced funding that will reach about $5 million a year. To put this in perspective, the previous government announced that it was going to replace its CF-18s with F-35 fighter jets at a cost of $16 billion. And the previous government seems on track to follow through with this. Now, I only bring that example to show you the difference in the budget. Most of the people who would stringently disagree purely on a principled basis that $5 million should be going to this program will argue the F-35s benefit all of us. They're in our interest as a country to ensure that we can defend ourselves. And this $5 million fee, even though it's microscopic in comparison, on a principled level should never be handed out for reasons I've already mentioned. So that's just to give you a quick overview of what the CCP is, what the debates are. But in order to argue whether the cases are frivolous, whether this is a good or a bad way to spend our money, really depends on which corner of the political spectrum you're coming from. Because it is truly impossible to ascribe any morality to it. If you're somebody who really likes access to justice, who thinks that there's an access to justice problem, who thinks that these challenges further justice in Canada, ensure that everybody gets the rights that they deserve, then you're going to be somebody who supports an action like this. If you're somebody who doesn't see the need for the government to get involved with paying lawyers to challenge its own laws, someone who thinks that really if these issues are so important, then you should be seeking out funding from other like-minded people who feel like this is an important issue that you're dealing with, then you're going to be somebody who disagrees with it. But I'm going to leave that for you two to debate. Pleasure being back on the podcast. Thank you very much for having me on, and I look forward to the next opportunity to make a fool of myself in front of dozens of listeners. Thanks, boys.
Thanks, Micah. I'm not going to say I know more about the law than you, but the judges on the Supreme Court of Canada do wear red, so perhaps at the top court they're more liberal-leaning than at the lower courts, but I'll leave that aside.
Honestly, I'm just happy he thinks at least 12 people are listening. But more seriously, Micah raised a couple good points, particularly around the access to justice issue, and that's kind of one of the areas I'm a little more skeptical of the benefits of this program, because it does seem, as he mentioned, that there's a huge problem with just how much it costs to bring any sort of legal action or any sort of court challenge, and $5 million or so isn't going to do a huge amount to swing that. And if we are going to be putting some money, even this small amount, into the justice system, would hiring a few more judges so you'd hear more cases or something else be more effective? Then targeted in this one particular area, especially when there are organizations that are stepping up to try and fill that role, like the BC Civil Liberties Association. They're kind of around the same areas. Their budgets are kind of around $1 million or so. You're looking at basically similar order of magnitude of this program right here. And, well, it would be nice to say have $10 million being spent on this. Are we necessarily getting the most bang for our buck on this, or would trying to spend that money to, even the little bit it does help, to reduce the overall cost of the system and make things flow more smoothly, make it so you ease up on the caseload of some judges, make it so you don't wait months between, a preliminary hearing and the main trial and all that sort of stuff? And is this really going to help the bigger problems of this, especially when you can often find funding from private organizations to bring these important challenges, like the Carter decision, which to the best of my knowledge wasn't funded by this program and yet had a profound impact on our charter rights. And Micah brings up a lot of good cases that were good case law was established from this. I'm just not sure that they wouldn't have also happened without this program.
So I think just like Micah's fighter jet example was actually kind of a bad argument. Like, we can have fighter jets if we want to have fighter jets, and there's a debate around that, and we can have or not have court challenges program, and just saying, well, we only have so much money. That's just the argument you kind of throw out to knock down anything you don't like. So I agree with all of the things you talked about that we need to fix. Like, we need more judges. The docket's going to come out on Sunday. I just saw on Twitter after hounding Michael Spratt about where's their latest podcast. And they've talked a lot about specific things that need to change in law or in the process of the judiciary in Canada, just in terms of having more justices and just making those processes easier. But I don't think that's what this fixes. The court challenges program, as I understand it, isn't about, oh, there's too many criminal cases facing Justice Smith in Cranbrook. It's about, has someone's fundamental rights been violated in a way that they need to challenge an unjust law? And bringing that forward has a lot of barriers. It costs a lot to hire smart lawyers to argue this. And these days, there are a lot of interveners in these kinds of cases. The BC Civil Liberties, of course, being one of them. I've worked for organizations that intervene in some of these cases, and they each bring different angles, and those are all important. But at the fundamental level, you have an individual who wants to test the law, and not just frivolously, like I've seen some people say in newspaper quotes like, oh, you shouldn't be able to knock laws down as easily as you can buy a sandwich, which no one's argued for. But you should have that ability. That's why I really like the Human Rights Tribunal system, because you can say, I've been discriminated against. Can I at least hear this without a cost being put on you? Or at least not a financial cost being put on you. You still have to go through the paperwork, and it's still pretty stressful. And so not a lot go through, but it works towards a mediation. It works towards a settlement. So I think we can tackle all of these different issues. I know the Liberal government has promised a lot of broader reform. They're looking at the criminal code right now. They're looking at just justice in general. I think this is one piece of the puzzle, and I think it's a good one. Personally, maybe because I like most of the cases they win, but I also think maybe progress goes in one direction and there's people who will drag their heels, but expanding rights and equality doesn't really set anyone back. It's not a zero-sum game. So I think there is space for this kind of program to help those who charities can't step in and help.
Oh, I do want to push back slightly on the limited amount of funds issue that you brought up, and because it is a very real constraint on basically any government program, and the government is never going to have enough money to do everything it wants. So there's always going to be some prioritization. So I don't think bringing that forward as an argument is necessarily a bad one, and should always be a primary consideration with any new government program or revival of old programs.
Well, I think that gives us a argument to have over, is 5 million enough? Should it be 10 million because there's more people in Canada now and there's inflation? Or should it be 3 million because the BCCLA is bigger than it was 10 years ago, I think. And that's a debate.
Well, I don't agree on that, because if there's an alternative approach that is more cost effective or more efficient or whatever that hypothetically is, there's no reason why this number for this program couldn't then be zero. if there was an alternative one. So I don't see it as being wherever the number is, as long as it's positive, is necessarily the right approach to take on this one in terms of limiting the range of possible numbers we're going to settle on.
At the end of the day, I guess it just comes down to that fundamental, do you think the private sector should be let free to do everything, or is there space for some government assistance? In Canada, we have the CBC, which provides media, because we say, look, we have private media, but it doesn't work great. And maybe it needs a boost too or something, and that's a whole other debate. But in Canada, we do have this mixed model of there's a bit of socialist help in everything, and that upsets a lot of people, of course. But we sort of get by with going, all right, well, it's not going to be totally socialist. We'll just have a bit of government help. So that's where I sort of have a lot of sympathy with this is let's help some people run their court challenges with the idea of hopefully we'll get a better law out of it.
I mean, I don't want to come across as being kind of against the program, because I think I'm more ambivalent on whether or not this is the best approach to solve the problem with, but I guess I'm trying more approaching this from a place of how to create the overall system that is most beneficial rather than trying to plug this particular hole that we have. And developing a good body of case law on the charter is important, and it's important that people be able to bring forward challenges. I guess my ambivalence on this is that it's focused very much on this one particular thing versus, and this might actually take more political capital, which is maybe a factor in it, but versus looking at the overall system and figuring out how do we just make it not as prohibitively expensive to bring cases forward, and just focusing on making, charter cases better funded. And I guess that kind of also goes to my more broader philosophy when it comes to what government should be doing in terms of kind of just setting the broadest base, where it should be more focused on setting out the playing field rather than trying to nudge little things here and there, these kind of small, small little program here, small little program there. It's much more important, at least from my perspective, be focusing on what's kind of the big picture rather than trying to fix a little thing here, a little thing there, and you just end up with a big patchwork of all these little programs that kind of intersect, and sometimes you'll have overlapping mandates or gaps between them where people fall through because they might not qualify for this program or legal aid, which, as we were talking about, there's a lot of middle-class people who can't really afford good legal help or to bring a case forward, and, if their charter rights aren't being violated or they're not under criminal prosecution, they get state legal aid for that. There's a big gap there that just doesn't get filled when you focus on the little tiny problems here and there versus what's the big picture and how do we kind of make just the broadest and widest policy decisions we can and let kind of the individual players work within a more accessible framework.
Well, perhaps that's the big missed opportunity here for Trudeau. They're rolling out, as I mentioned, hopefully more justice reforms. Rolling them out piecemeal does give them more stories and more positive news coverage, like, oh, we're doing this thing that is generally a positive thing for Canada, but they don't build that strong case. So you can criticize any one thing because it's a band-aid on a gaping flesh wound. And maybe by the end of their first mandate, they'll have covered most of it. It doesn't have that same effect as sort of rolling it all out at once if they do it. And given how they've sort of walked back a number of other promises or just stuck things in everlasting committees and consultations, you're probably right to be skeptical and cynical.
Yeah, and I don't think this is necessarily a bad program. I just ambivalent on whether or not this is the thing we really need to be focused on bringing back right now.
Maybe the solution is just for Micah and his downtown lawyer friends to take some paid cuts, and then everyone wins. But thankfully, he does his work for us pro bono.
Moving on to segment 3, Counting Canucks. The 2016 census data is starting to be released, and Canada's population has surpassed 35 million, with most of those gains going to Western Canada. The biggest population growth being in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia, respectively. So the West is definitely kind of winning the demographic game, if you want to call it that. All provinces except New Brunswick grew since the 2011 census. New Brunswick shrank by 0.5%, which, given the rather dismal economic performance and lack of opportunities there compared to the rest of Canada, I'm not hugely surprised about.
Overall, this is a good news story for Trudeau. It's just the result of that census we all got super nerdy over last year. The one where people crashed the website because everyone was like, the census is back and it's mandatory again and data is going to be good again. So this is the sort of result of that big excitement of doing the census last year. Digging into the data a little more on the specific implications. As you were saying, Alberta and BC are having this large growth. These were also the provinces that were still underrepresented in Parliament, especially compared to the Maritimes or the territories. But here you have Alberta and BC now with 110 to 120,000 people per riding, whereas the territories and PEI have something like 35,000 people per riding. The rest of the Maritimes have in the 70s, and even Saskatchewan has in that range. Ontario and Quebec, it turns out, are actually in the same area as Alberta and BC, which is each MP has to represent a lot of people. Now, it's never a popular decision to bring in more MPs, but under the way our Constitution's sort of framed, the only way we can balance the House, as it were, is to bring in more MPs because PEI is guaranteed its 4 representatives.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a long-running pet peeve of mine is the dramatic shifts in how much each vote counts depending on which riding they're in. When I last looked at this on the 2011 census and the 2015 seat redistribution, the riding of Labrador was the most overrepresented in Parliament, and it's roughly 3.6 times what a vote in Vancouver Quadra, our riding, is worth. And, that's massively distorted in terms of where the representation is in Canada. And, the West is both in the Senate and in Parliament largely gotten screwed on the vote distribution. The number of senators keeps PEI's numbers artificially inflated. Quebec has locked in at a minimum of 75 seats, even though the West's population's growing significantly faster, which means they're overrepresented too. And it's a kind of a long-term problem in Canada, especially when, we saw in the last election that, it was decided by the time the polls closed in Vancouver. And I think this problem's only going to get worse as the West continues to grow and the East stagnates or shrinks.
Eric Grenier gave an interesting analysis on CBC about this, and he highlights how the growth is in mostly conservative ridings. And that's pretty obvious when it's mostly in Alberta and BC. And it's interesting, he broke it down by the riding level, and the NDP is actually in the most trouble because all of their ridings had the most stagnant growth. They sort of have these industrial towns where they're not growing, but they're not shrinking at least. The Liberals are also in a pretty good shape with most of their areas growing. A different way to rectify the situation, though, that I heard Elizabeth May talking about earlier this week, and it ties back to the killing of the electoral reform promise, is Trudeau could appoint more MPs to balance this better, but make them sort of regional MPs who are elected based on the raw vote almost, or are elected to make BC's distribution of MPs closer match the vote share of the province. I don't know how easy that would be to do, or if there'd be constitutional arguments against that, but it's an interesting idea that I don't see anyone else taking up.
Well, the problem with that, though, is if you use PEI as the floor because they have a constitutionally guaranteed 4 seats, and that means they have an average of 35,727 people per riding, which in a country of basically 35 million, that works out to 979 MPs, which is insanely huge. You wouldn't have space for them all.
You just triple the size of the House of Commons. Well, in Britain, they have many more peers than that can fit in the House of Lords. They have something like 800 peers, and only 400 or 500 can fit in there at any one time. So they just run through to vote if they have to. That obviously isn't a good argument against tripling the number of politicians, because that's going to annoy a lot of people and cost a lot.
Yeah, I think very few Canadians would put not enough politicians at the top of their list of problems with this country.
If you want to bring down the control of the leader, putting dozens more backbenchers in who then have no chance of ever making it to cabinet's one way to do it. I still don't think it's going to happen.
I don't see that being too helpful in Canada's context, because there's a lot of other sticks the party leaders use, especially the refusal to sign the nomination papers and effectively veto any candidacy, that any mouthy backbencher, even if they're surrounded by 900 peers, aren't going to be too mouthy with that hanging over their head.
Well, let's switch from the hypothetical realm we're getting into to the more hyper-local angle of the census. People have done a couple interesting analyses looking at the city of Vancouver, and one thing that's in the census data is the number of unoccupied homes. Andy Yan, the UBC economist, looked at the census number and found there's 25,000 unoccupied homes in Vancouver, which is actually a 15% jump over last year, and it's something that's been rising. And it's not just the total number of unoccupied homes is rising, which you'd expect, but the percentage of Vancouver that's unoccupied has been rising over roughly 30 years. And when you contrast that with some of the other municipalities around the Lower Mainland, they're not all rising equally. So it almost suggests there's some policy differences between Vancouver and Burnaby that mean Burnaby is actually able to fill the houses it has. The other analysis of the city of Vancouver shows there's a fleeing from the richer neighborhoods on the west side of Vancouver, sort of Shaughnessy, and some of those are actually shrinking. There's fewer and fewer people in them as an absolute number, and more people are moving into the sort of east side where there's cheaper homes. That's not really surprising. It's sort of what you'd expect, and especially in aging neighborhoods where the kids move out and then it's just grandparents living there and then they downsize their house.
Yeah, and that's probably part of the reason why Burnaby, for example, has kept the number a little lower, is just because it's more affordable there. And I think this does give a little more credence to the foreign speculator argument behind high house prices in Canada, or in Vancouver in particular, because you have seen this increase, and while it isn't huge, it is something, and it also would make sense that you'd see it more in kind of the very high value neighborhoods, because, you know, those are the highest value, and that'd be the part that would attract foreign investors. And even if there's any policy differences, and it's kind of hard to do it at the municipal level, at least there isn't much going on right now at the municipal level I can see that really hints at that. And if anything, it might just be the branding of Vancouver versus Burnaby or Richmond. Vancouver is the kind of focal point of the area, and it's what everybody knows internationally.
Yeah, my big issue with the sort of housing debate of Vancouver has been just the utter lack of data. People just sort of go from their biases and say, oh, I saw some empty houses on my block, therefore this is the leading problem. But here when we can say there are, by this measure, more unoccupied homes per capita than there were 15 years ago or whatever, but house prices are still rising, as in there should be more supply, which would lead house prices to come down, but it's those unoccupied homes probably aren't on the market.
Yeah, and that's, you know, can be a concern, but it's usually mostly a concern when you are very supply limited and supply is inelastic. Ultimately, the market wouldn't really care that much if somebody lives in it or not, if there was an equally, you know, if there's just another home that somebody else could occupy, and the supply would equalize with demand, and you get a much lower equilibrium price than what's happening right now, where it is much more supply constrained, and the foreign buyer issue becomes much more pronounced when it is very supply limited.
I'm just arguing that if there's a bunch of unoccupied homes, that means there is space for more people to move here, but those aren't on the market for people to move into. And that's hinting that maybe the supply isn't as limited as it's saying, except artificially by people owning homes that they're not living in, or that they only visit briefly. Well, going into a few quick stories to close out the show. First, Canada's confirmed that we're going to engage in post-TPP talks. The Trump administration has walked away from the TPP, so it's dead, but a lot of countries have done a lot of work on this agreement, and Canada being one of them. we don't want to waste it all. So Canada's going to go to Chile and start talking with the other countries and see what we can make happen.
Yeah, and we brought this up previously when Trump announced his intention to withdraw. And yeah, I think this is exactly the right move. There's value to be establishing closer trading ties with these countries, whether or not the U.S. is involved with it. And hopefully we'll still have NAFTA to deal with them, though we'll see how well that goes. But having a closer trading relationship with these other countries is very useful. Japan is a huge market, and having tariff-free access there would be big for Canada and would help quite a bit. And this might also become a little less controversial now that the U.S. is out of it too, because the two big controversies were the intellectual property provisions and the investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms. And while we might not see much change on the second one, the first one, though, was primarily pushed by the U.S. So this is an opportunity for everybody to bring the TPP in, but with a much less controversial intellectual property chapter too. And we'll see if there's any appetite to renegotiate that. But, if the U.S. out of this, not pushing for much more stringent IP policies, I could see it becoming a easier sell in Canada and around the world too. In corporate welfare news, the federal government has announced that it's given a $372.5 million interest-free loan to Bombardier. The company's been in trouble for quite a while now. Quebec recently gave them a $1 billion investment in their C-Series jet, and right now we're adding on to it. And in my opinion, it's a little disingenuous to call this an interest-free loan. It's a subsidy, and it's pretty cut and dry case of corporate welfare. For one thing, we're in a deficit, so that means the Canadian taxpayer is picking up the tab for the interest on that. Even if you were to leave out questions of what fair market value of that would be, we're actually going to be paying interest on this money. And Bombardier has been a continual problem. It's, late delivering the Toronto streetcars. Its C-Series jets had a whole bunch of problems. It's basically been mismanaged, and rather than, let creative destruction take its course and weed out the inefficient and unprofitable firms in an economy, the Liberals have decided to hand out a bunch of taxpayer money to a well-connected Quebec business.
So you see the obvious opposition from this coming from people like Maxime Bernier, who's libertarian stance.
And props to him, because he's a Quebec politician, and this is not a popular opinion in Quebec.
Yeah, and there's not a politician in Canada who, once I think they're in power, would actually turn down the sort of Bombardier coming for the handout. Bernier's opposition's ideological, and as you say, he's taking a gutsy position, challenging the Quebec orthodoxy. But I think even in this case, the Liberals didn't give Bombardier as much as they were asking for. And that's not to say it's not still corporate welfare. It definitely is. Bombardier is almost like that relative you have who keeps screwing up, but you're like, they're family, so we have to support them. It sucks. We don't want to dump them on the street. And it's complicated because it's an actual for-profit private company that should be standing on its own 2 feet. But it does, employ a lot of people in Quebec and across Canada. It's one of those national companies we sort of have. So I don't know that anyone would have actually said no. I don't even know that Maxime Bernier, if he were prime minister with a conservative government that wasn't as ideological as him, because he's one wing of that party, and to keep it together, would he have turned it down? In that position? It's hard to say. It's easy to make those kind of pronouncements when you're running for a leadership, but when you're faced with hundreds or thousands of job losses and really angry people who could be your voter base in Quebec City or wherever.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine kicking them out and cutting them off, but it's definitely a case where not everybody is going to see it that way. And yeah, it's kind of unfortunate for the people who work there, but at the same time, there's a longer term problem that occurs where we accumulate inefficient and unprofitable businesses that aren't allowed to go bankrupt. And it eventually might not do it now, might not do it for a couple of years, but enough of these happen, and eventually you have a huge drag on the economy out of it. And capitalism works to the extent that it does because you also, in addition to the profits, there are losses to it, and there is creative destruction, and you do get rid of those not very effective businesses. And one thing that's constantly brought up in these cases that other governments around the world subsidize their aerospace industry, but I've never found that a particularly convincing case because, if Donald Trump wants to make it so I can buy a cheaper aircraft, I'm not necessarily going to say no to it, but I don't think we should be spending our money to make it easier for people to buy cheaper aircrafts just because they happen to be made in Canada. And in the long run, it hurts us by propping up these unprofitable businesses, even if it does save a few jobs in the short term. What are the foregone jobs that aren't created because there's this economic drag slowing everything else down?
Well, speaking of creative destructions, the Liberals have still been spinning their tires trying to explain why they've killed the electoral reform file. And we covered this extensively last week, so I just want to follow up with what they've been saying in the last week. The biggest one is Justin Trudeau said at one of these town hall rally events, when someone asked him about why did you kill electoral reform, he basically said, well, you don't want the Kelly Leitch party in Parliament, do you? Almost ignorant of the fact that Kelly Leitch could just win the Conservative Party of Canada leadership, and then there would be a Kelly Leitch party, and it would be huge.
Not to mention, First Past the Post hasn't kept Kelly Leitch out of Parliament.
Yeah, and it didn't keep Donald Trump out. So it's doubling down on those bad arguments that were addressed in the committee's report. There's people leaking to the press that it's really this fear of the alt-right that drove Trudeau to kill this program, because it pretty much was him. Karina Gould just got given the job of burying the body. And so we were pretty much right, I think, when we talked last week about him just being afraid of Nazis.
Although I've always thought that was a bit of overblown fear. And I can understand him not wanting to spend political capital when there's a giant tire inferno to our south that kind of needs his attention. But it would be nice if he'd actually be honest with us and say so, that, hey, this isn't going to be a priority, things have shifted. And I think Canadians would be a lot more receptive to that argument than Kelly Leitch will be more successful. Speaking of Liberal promises, one of their primary campaign pledges was to reverse the increase of the OAS age to 67 and bring it back down to 65. Harper upped it by 2 years with a 10-year lead time before the new policy came into effect. So OAS is the old age security program, and it was increased because Canadians are living a little longer. You have longer, healthier retirements, and the life expectancy is significantly higher than when the program was first introduced. And with an aging population, this has potential to be a drain on the federal finances, and if people are foregoing work, this also might be a slowdown on the economy a bit too. So that was the reason why it was increased, and then the Liberals campaigned on bringing it back down. And recently, the government's Economic Advisory Council has recommended that the age actually be increased from its current 65, and the government has promptly shut down that suggestion. So it does kind of raise the question of where was this, government's commitment to evidence-based policy? We have a panel of experts here recommending that the age at which people retire be modestly increased, not rush onto it. We're not going to force someone who's 64 and a half and expect to retire next year to several more years of it. It's going to be a longer term thing. But it does raise the question of why aren't they following the advice of their own Economic Advisory Council? And this was a government that campaigned on evidence, and where are they now?
Well, this is one place where they're looking to keep their promise, despite the recommendation you're talking about. There's arguments they're making, of course, that this age, 65, can be just as sustainable as 67 if you play with the numbers in the right way. And I think that's where they can get their pass. It's complicated enough, and there's enough variables at play that this one tweak they can leave if they take on the other recommendations, because these are big reports that come out with lots of different focuses and talking about starting innovation panels and finding other ways to kickstart. There's also this sort of argument that there are too many older people still at work, and that's causing trouble for younger people trying to get into the job market. So there's different ways to look at it, and maybe at the end of the day, they just don't want to upset too many old people because that'll cost them re-election.
And I think that was part of the calculus here, is that any downsides of not raising this age, it's not going to be felt for, years down the road. They'll probably be out of power by then, or they can start to think about it if they're still in power 15 years from now or something. But right now, the costs aren't really being borne too heavily, and it's not popular raising the retirement age, so they're going to, I think, punt on the issue, even if it does cause some, I think, longer-term issues, and, us younger folks will probably be paying a little more for it down the road.
Well, speaking of that political calculus, Campaign Research has a new poll out in the Hill Times showing that the Liberals and Conservatives are tied at 34%. It's another sort of hint at the question of, is the honeymoon over 18 months later or whatever it is? Trudeau's approval rating is down to 39%, and interestingly, his net approval is -7, which means more people are not happy with what he's doing rather than are happy. Comparatively, the interim leaders of the NDP and Conservatives both have positive net ratings. The NDP is only at 16% in this poll, and the Greens and Bloc fill out at 6%. I don't know a lot about Campaign Research, but it sort of fits in the realm of what other polls have been saying, that the Liberals have been coming down, and when the Conservatives don't have a leader, it is easy to sort of park your vote there and go, Rona Ambrose is doing a decent job as Conservative leader.
Yeah, this far out, they're not that predictive, and we have 2 leadership races to include, but I think we're beyond the point of where it's a hint now, and it's pretty clear the Liberal honeymoon's over, and now it's really going to be a question of where do the parties go from here. The Conservatives have been making the biggest gains, especially compared to their election night performance. So if they can elect a leader that's not too crazy or doesn't alienate too many Canadians, they have a good shot at being quite competitive going into the next election. And unfortunately for the NDP, the numbers aren't showing the same trend for them. And maybe they'll have, a real rock star candidate come forward, win the leadership, and kind of help push the party's popularity up.
Well, Charlie Angus was in a punk rock band.
Good news for the Conservatives, bad news for basically everyone else, but it's still too tentative at this point, especially prior to May and October for the Conservatives and the NDP, respectively. And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.